we can have that on the recording, please.
All right. Thank you once more, colleagues. I am recording now. I am so blessed and so proud for me to introduce to you Deborah Russell, the former president, honorary president of WASLI, strong supporter of Africa, to this platform. You're welcome.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be with you this morning. This morning for me, this afternoon for you.
Sure, that's right. Thank you so much. And also, I want to also introduce a veteran sign language interpreter in the US. In Africa, we call her a Wonder Woman, although that's her name. But she's Wanda Newman, a very energetic woman that is ready to give all our intellectual rights for Africa at this point in time. Welcome, Wanda.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. And we also have my brother, Jack. I think, Jack, I came to WASLI and I met Jack waiting from Kenya, sometimes in WASLI. And I know that he has been in the profession and practice within the African continent. And he has gathered so much experience in Africa. Mr. Jack, good to see you. Happy to see you again.
Thank you for welcoming me. I'm glad to be part of the panel, and hello to Deborah and the rest.
Hello to Jack. It's been a long time. I'm so happy to see you.
Okay, and in this panel, I also have someone.
Nice to see you too.
Okay, thank you. I also have someone that is serving on the panel and also as my technical assistant at this point, supporting me from the behind with the Zoom meeting and other things from the behind. A very good and wonderful sister, Cynthia Norman. Ma, good to have you on the platform. Thank you, Cynthia. Lisa Williams also have been a very strong supporter. I remember the time I met Deborah Russell and I met Lisa Williams, both of them in Durban, South Africa, when WASLI graciously supported me to be at the first meeting of WASLI. I'm so glad to meet Lisa Williams, and I hope she is going to join this meeting at some point in time because I can find her here at the moment. But once she comes, she's going to introduce herself. Now, for the purpose of this meeting, we will like to have some 2-minute introduction from the panelists to be able to tell us who they are and what they do at the moment, just to really meet you, and for my other colleagues within the African continent to meet you and to know who you are properly. So I will start with Deborah Russell. You have 2 minutes to do that, and we go to the next person. Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy. I hope everyone can hear me. Yes. It's just a pleasure to be with you. As Timothy said, I'm the former honorary president of the World Association of Sign Language Interpreters. And like each of you in the room today, I still work as a sign language interpreter. So I'm based in Canada. That's my home. I live in the western part of Canada in Alberta, Calgary. And while I have many, many years of experience, I'm a little bit embarrassed when Timothy said, say how much experience you have. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say it's over 40 years. But some days it feels like 40 minutes. And that's the joy of our work, is that every day is so unique that we never feel like we know everything that we need to know. And so I love that. I have a community-based practice. I'm an interpreter educator, so I teach other interpreters. And I'm also a researcher. So I work at a university and conduct research about interpreting. And my community-based practice is often legal, mental health, medical, a bit of post-secondary, not much anymore given my travel schedule. And given COVID, I've been doing video remote interpreting in ways that I never did before. And this is just what we do now with COVID. So I think in terms of an introduction as well too, I really like people to know that I'm an active practitioner, so that the decisions that I have to face in the ethical realm are exactly what you face in the ethical realm. And so I'm really looking forward to learning from everyone on the panel today. And I'm so thrilled especially to see Jack, who was our very first African WASLI rep. And so in 2005, he came on board with us. And so we were so grateful for his leadership and commitment to interpreters on the African continent, but also internationally. So again, it's a pleasure to be with you. I look forward to learning from each and every one of you. Thank you for the time to introduce myself, Tim.
Thank you so much, President Deb. And I will go on with Wanda Newman. Please, Mark, can you introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Wanda Newman. I'm based here in Washington, D.C. I'm not ashamed to say, Deborah, but I have over 40 years of experience in the field. However, I am currently retired. So Cynthia Norman went and dug up this old relic because of her interest in revamping a directory that was published back in the early 90s. That became affectionately known as the Blue Book in the deaf community. So primarily I worked in public education for over 35 years, worked as a community-based interpreter for the entire 40 years, have done training and mentored interpreters around the country as well. So again, just an old relic, and I was only asked to come out of hiding because of Cynthia Norman's interest in this Blue Book and trying to revamp it and getting people interested in the need of having a directory to identify African American Black interpreters around the country, so that we are having the same opportunities as other interpreters out there in the field. So I don't know if anybody's seen a recent plug on our idea about some of the challenges our Asian Pacific Islanders interpreters face. So as people of color, regardless of your ethnicity, who face all kinds of challenges out there. So that's who I am, and thank you for the invitation. I'm just here to speak from the heart.
All right, thank you, Wanda, for the brief introduction. And I would like to call on Jack Oweti for you to introduce yourself. Thank you.
As you've heard, my name is Jack Oweti. I have worked as an interpreter for 20 years, part of it being both in leadership and also actively interpreting on a day basis. And from the veterans in the room, also to hear the new interpreters asking questions from all over Africa. So I'm very excited to be part of the panel. And also, as the two speakers before me have said, the ethical decisions that we face are similar, maybe different in magnitude, maybe different in the settings, but they're all the same. And I look forward to learning more about how we behave, how we do our decision making when we are faced with different challenges. And just talking about what I'm currently doing, I'm currently interpreting for the national briefing for COVID-19 and also doing some Zoom interpretation for the deaf community in Kenya. So I'm excited to learn more and also to share my experience with the rest of the team.
Thank you so much, Jack. I know Cynthia is busy taking notes. Can you just allow us to meet you? Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, hello. Such a pleasure to be here. My name is Cynthia Norman. I've been an interpreter for 35 plus years in the field. Have worked freelance interpreting, worked for Sorensen in the past, served as a director for a call center for about 4 years, which had me traveling to the East Coast a lot, and I fell in love with the East Coast. I was in Seattle, Washington before, fell in love with the East Coast, moved to DC, trying to get my footing here. Was inspired by other Black interpreters to pick up Wanda Newman's work. Came across a publication of a kind of a history book of an organization in the area, and the blue book was in there. There was this directory of Black interpreters, and where is it now? We don't have one. And decided to see if my feet were big enough to fit in Wanda Newman's shoes. And I'm sloshing around a little bit because the shoes are really big, but picking up where she left off to try to make sure that we have a documentation of Black interpreters around the world now. It started off a more local United States national directory, and then decided to see what happens if we make it global. And that's where I was able to come into contact with different individuals who are here on this forum here, this Zoom meeting, and to be able to open that up to the world. So I'm here. I'm excited to be able to connect with each of you. I am above and beyond honored that I can even pick up where Wanda left off. She did an amazing work. And in my attempts to include people in the new updated book, people are still mentioning the blue book as when they were in the blue book back in 1995 and 2000, like, I'm in Mama Wanda's book. So y'all call her Wonder Woman. They call her Mama Wanda over here. So it's a huge undertaking, and I'm honored to be able to be in connection with Wanda, and I'm only here as a result of her work. So I'm looking forward to being able to talk with you guys about ethics, to learn from you. We all believe that this work that we're in is, we never just get to the point where we already know it. So the ongoing discussions are important, and it's important to be able to discuss it with interpreters everywhere, because there's so much we can each bring to each other's table. So I'm thrilled to be at your table, and I'm looking forward to whatever you serve and dish up, and I'm eating it up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wanda. Recently, somebody just asked me, sorry, Cynthia, somebody just recently asked me if Wanda is your mom, but I said no. Well, we will talk about that maybe later. However, while the meeting was going on, a very, very dear sister, Lisa Weems, just popped into the meeting, and I would like her to really introduce herself, a sister to Africa and planning to relocate to Africa, maybe. So, Lisa Weems.
It seems like you really wish that I relocate to Africa. And as I get deeper and deeper in, I think that might have to happen, at least for a while anyway. But hello, everybody. Hello, Deborah. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
And Jack, I saw Jack Owiti here. I understand that you've been ill, and I'm glad to see that you're well. I'm glad to see that you're well. I am Lisa Weems. I am just a workhorse, and I'm interested in education and training and ethics and diversity and inclusion and organizational development around the world. And so where I go where I'm needed. After WASLI in 2011, Nigeria invited me to come and have some involvement in their development, and I did, and the result is my being here. I've worked over the years with Nigeria. I will continue to work with Nigeria. But now that we're doing this project in Zambia, we intend to create a model that we can take all over the continent. So it's a long commitment, a long-term commitment, but we are committed to making sure that this comes to fruition. And there are so many amazing things that we can learn from our African brothers and sisters, and I'm excited about that.
Thank you so much, Lisa Weems. Then we will like to go into details of this conversation. Just like I've said, there are a lot of issues relating to our profession here in the continent of Africa, and it's very, very important that we discuss or create a platform where we can always share this information with other colleagues in other countries, so that we will not be left behind. We'll all know how to pick it up, and we can work together to achieve that. Sign language interpreting backbone is in the code of ethics, just like any other profession. Though the profession here in Africa is quite new and very, very difficult for us to go through the terrain at some points. But however, if we know and we're proud of our own associations on our profession, it's good for us to be able to at least get so much information about it, and how willing are we within the African continent for us to be able to move forward with the ideas we want to share. Most of the times, we find ourselves in some ethical dilemmas that we don't find a way out, or we get confused, or we don't even have an answer to it. And I'm sure very well that this should be something that some of you must have gone through sometimes in your own situation, and you are willing and ready to also share with us. And you are also willing and ready to share with us. So I just want to ask, Wanda, you have been in this practice, like we've discussed, for more than 4 decades. And being in this practice for more than 4 decades, I believe that you've come through some ethical dilemmas that has made you to make some certain decisions that not necessarily is mentioned in the code of ethics, but based on reasonable man's standard, you were able to find your way out. For the purpose of those that are participating in this meeting, I want to tell you that ethical standard, the reasonable man's standard, is when you ask yourself what your decision is all about. Is it fair? Is it just? Is it honest? You have to think about that. And that's what we're talking about. Where the law is silent, is it just? Is it honest? Is it sincere? What makes you to take those decisions? So we will want you to talk about your situation when you early entered into the profession of sign language interpretation. Mr. Weinman, please. Newman, I mean, Wanda.
Alrighty, so let me just say, by the time I entered into the profession of sign language interpreting, RID already existed, and there was already a published set of code of ethics in place. However, it did not mean that everyone who was a practicing interpreter in the United States were abiding by this code of ethics. One, if you were not a member of RID, did you have to uphold to that particular code of ethics? There were even employers and agencies who took a position of that you did not have to follow RID's particular code of ethics. As I said, I worked in public education for 35 years. Now, not only did we have RID's professional code of ethics, which became the professional code of conduct, we also had laws, federal laws. Public Law 94-142 that later on became the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that talked about interpreting services. However, this is at the federal level, when things trickle down to our little local public school system, interpretation of laws. At the bottom line, I worked for a particular agency who at the time had no policy, little to no regulation to the hiring of interpreters, to the use of interpreters, to the educational attainment of interpreters, to credentialing of interpreters, to skill ability of interpreters. What it came down to for me, as you said, is it is about your own personal professional of conduct and ethics. What is your responsibility in this role as an interpreter? How honest are you about your ability and your service to the community? How trustworthy can you be to the community? How fair are you? I worked for a community of people who had little to no voice because they were children. They were under the age of 18. Adults made decisions for them all the time. Were they not entitled to quality interpreting services, regardless of who the employer was and who they hired? Because my former employer hired people without a high school diploma, without credentials, without anything. Their current job description, I believe, is still on file at this time in 2020, says you only need one course, one class, not even a 15-week session in sign language to be hired as an interpreter by this particular entity. So it was about me and what I needed to do to provide quality services to a community of people who were in desperate need of an equal playing field out there. Because I couldn't get a quality public education who was deaf and hard of hearing if they did not have quality interpreting services. So it was my personal decision to write my own professional development prescription, to continue taking courses and pursuing and staying current within the field. Not my employer, not a code of ethics. This was Wandaism. What I needed to do to maintain quality services to a community of people. I volunteered in the deaf community. I heard their cries. As a hearing individual, I wasn't there just to, tap into their resources. Oh, they sign. I want to learn to sign. No, I became involved. They allowed me to become a member of the community. And then becoming a member of the community, I had a responsibility. So oftentimes I provided interpreting services during the local BDA meetings when hearing individual came to make presentation at no cost. But I got wonderful feedback from the community who allowed me to excel in the field, even though at a time when I was in this profession, it was not easy for a person of color, and especially of African descent, to have a position in the field. So again, it comes down to you as individuals. What do you need to do to maintain a quality of service and a commitment to the community that you're out there to serve? Are you coming to your assignments prepared? Do you know when to say no? Do you know your abilities? Because just because someone offers you an assignment doesn't mean you need to accept it. Because if you're not the right interpreter for the job, turn down the job. Don't be a disservice to the community. Are you dressed appropriately for the job? Are you coming to every assignment dressed like a professional? And I don't care where the assignment is. If they have you out there in the mud, you're going to dress professionally for that assignment. You're going to be in rubber boots and jeans, whatever that attire is for that assignment. But you're going to look like a professional interpreter. So that's pretty much it. It's about your attitude. In the absence of professional standards out there, you have to have some level of professionalism about what you're doing and your commitment to the community you serve. Because the community that you're serving is not just people who are deaf and hard of hearing. They're hearing individuals. Those agencies and companies that hire you to interpret for them, you're representing them as well. And the individuals who are receiving the services, they're expecting quality services. They're expecting equal footing in that whole dialogue that's going on. And they can't get that if you're a lousy interpreter. So again, it's about you making a commitment to being a professional interpreter, regardless if you have standards out there or not. There's professional standards and professional conduct that each and every one of us use when we go into a meeting, regardless of what kind of meeting it is. You carry yourself a certain way, and you have to carry yourself a certain way in this profession. So that's pretty much it for me. But like
Thank
I
you
said,
so much, Wanda.
we have procedures, we have laws, but again, they're all up for interpretation. So everybody have a different interpretation of all these laws and policies and procedures out there. But at the end of the day, it is about your ethical behavior, your professional conduct, your heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wanda. I can summarize by saying, as a sign language interpreter, you have to take responsibility as a sign language interpreter. Every decision, every intention counts, and it judges your professional input that you're going to give to whatever work that has been given unto you. Important key to what she has said. She said, if you are not fit for the job, not necessarily you have to accept that job. You can decline in accepting that job because ethically you might be wrong when you take care of the job and other things like that. So thank you so much, Wanda. I will go back to Deborah Russell. Deb, I know that the adoption of the Association of Visual Language Interpreters in the 1988, which is first administered, the certification or the test was first administered in 1990. Where were you at that time when that adoption was taken? What were you doing before that time? You have to unmute your phone. Have to unmute. Dave, you need to unmute.
How's that?
Yeah, thank you.
Is that better?
Yeah, better.
Perfect. So when I started, like Wanda said, RID existed. And so for many of us as Canadian interpreters, our first organization was RID. But in 1977, when I started, there wasn't a Canadian organization. 1979, we formed AFSLI, and we went with a name called the Association of Visual Language Interpreters of Canada. Sometimes people say, why did you choose that? And because we're a bilingual country, English, French, we had LSQ, French interpreters, we had American Sign Language English interpreters.
Canada as well.
And way back when, we also had oral interpreters. And so the visual language was the closest thing that we could find in terms of being inclusive. And then we formed our national organization in 1979. So AFSLI existed for, I think, some 8 years, and we quickly adopted a code of ethics from RID. But I want you to think about the time. It was a code of ethics that had 8 sentences on it. That's all it was 8 sentences, which really didn't offer a lot of guidance. So I think for each of us, as Wanda said, we sought out mentors. We stood on the shoulders of those who came before us. And so there were many interpreters that I worked with who had deaf family. There were many interpreters who worked as teachers at the School for the Deaf, and then in evenings worked as interpreters. Those people became our guides on the side, our mentors. And so they reinforced the idea that regardless of the fact that we just have 8 lines on this sheet of paper, that there are some common core values that all of us have to have. So our code of ethics in AFSLI morphed into a values-based code of ethics in the year 2000, which I think was really helpful in articulating the values that we hold. And many of those values are what Wanda has already alluded to. But we value accountability for our own decisions. We value respect for diversity in our community. We want to be able to respect consumer choices and all kinds of things. So the values shaped that code of ethics. And then you've asked about our certification. And so once we felt like we had an ethical base upon which to train people to make good decisions on, because this won't tell me what to do. This will give me some ideas about what our core values are and what the tenets are that we subscribe to. So things like confidentiality, absolutely. Impartiality, yes. I don't need to say my own opinions in somebody else's interaction. So I need to get out of the way so that they can interact. And I need to make the best decision in each situation for the community that I'm working in, for the profession, for the consumers that are working with me right now. But the bottom line for me is always about protecting consumers. That's what a code of ethics is supposed to do, is protect consumers, not for us to hide behind, but for us to take responsibility for our decisions for protecting the profession and protecting consumers. And our first certification was created in 1990, and you asked what I was doing at the time. I was the president of our national association at that point.
Wow.
So I'd been president of our provincial chapter in Alberta for several years prior to that. I joined the AFSLI board, I believe, in 1986, and by 1988 I was president and creating our own national certification system. And we did that not out of disrespect for RID's certification system, because many of us were RID certified, but we did it because we wanted the deaf community in Canada to help us design a system that fit their needs. And so one of the things that is unique, I think, about the Canadian experience is that our evaluation system from the very beginning was designed with the deaf community. So there was significant input from the Canadian Association of the Deaf and the Canadian Cultural Society of the Deaf were our main partners. And so the three organizations came together and determined what the standard would be. And so the first testing, as you said, was released in 1990, and it's a high bar. And it's a high bar for which I don't apologize for, because it's a high bar that the deaf community said, that's the standard. It's fine for all of you to graduate from interpreting programs. You can get out and work, but we want the certification to really mean that you can do the work, so that we feel comfortable that you are coming, that you are adequately prepared for the task, and that you know what you're doing, and that you will do no harm. So all of those things came together, I think, in our certification system. And so that's how we evolved. And our certification system is now under review, and there's lots of talk about whether we'll go in a similar direction to RID, move the certification out of the organization and have it done by a separate body. But you know, I'm incredibly grateful for those early years where we necessarily had to form a code of ethics, we had to form organizations, we had to form networks of interpreters, and those for me were really very, very valuable experiences, because they taught me the value of working collaboratively across communities, across really diverse communities of deaf communities, interpreting communities. And so again, I think, you know, is there ever a perfect code of ethics? There never is. But there's a perfect set of standards that will reflect your work. And if they have those common tenets of confidentiality, impartiality, making the best decisions possible, understanding it's a decision-making process, I think that's the most important piece for me. So maybe I'll stop there and see if you have other questions, but I think that's what you asked me to.
Thank you so much, Deb. Confidentiality, protection of the consumers, and I'm so glad to hear that you were you were elected, or you were assigned or nominated, or whatever it is. You were the president of the association in 1990. What a coincidence! I read that in a book, and I just want to ask you a direct question. Did the government approve your certification at that time that you sat down together with the people to draft it? Did your government approve it? How did your government approve the certification? Just be precise.
Canada's a very, very large country. And so we have a federal government system and then a provincial government system. So AFSLI, as a national organization, now it's known as the Canadian Association of Sign Language Interpreters, is federally incorporated. So our certification system, our code of ethics, our bylaws, those kinds of things are under the Federal Societies Act, so to speak. We have one provincial chapter, British Columbia, that also has provincial licensing, so legal licensing requirements. And so they have a slightly different grievance process, a slightly different code of ethics, nothing very different, but they have to have their own in order to managing the licensing process. But our government, I think, doesn't oversee any pieces of the certification system. They recognize certification, absolutely, but they don't oversee it in any way.
All right, thank you so much, Deb. Thanks for that explanation. And
question?
Yeah, thank you so much. I will still come back to you, Deb. I will go to Lisa Weems. Lisa, I assumed that when you were growing up, sign language interpretation was not your profession. You don't intend to go into sign language interpretation. If that was your intention, what inspires you to go into sign language interpretation? If that wasn't your intention, then why did you become a sign language interpreter, and how were you able to catch up with the policy, the procedures, and the process of being a member of the interpreting community? How do you get into it? How do you get acquainted with the code?
I can't hear you. There's too much interference.
Okay, please, I will request that all participants, you mute your voice, mute your mic, or we have to maybe find that
Ogunbayo and somebody else was there. There's when there's sound from those sources, it lights up, and those are the ones that are lighting up. So whoever that Ogunbayo is, please mute that mic. And Oho Ishmael, can you Ojo, can you mute that mic too?
My Nigerian brothers, can you please mute your mic? Can you mute your mic? If you don't mute your mic, I might need to take you out of the meeting. You need to mute your mic or you go out of the meeting.
Mr. Chairman, sir, I
Yes.
think you should do that from your hand. Please do that from your hand.
Or Cynthia,
Cynthia, can you hear me, Cynthia?
I can hear you.
Please help me to take Ogunbayo out of the meeting.
Mr. Chairman.
As the host, I believe you can do that. Just mute everyone.
So I believe the control is on your.
Yes.
If you are the host, then it is in your
Cynthia,
control.
Cynthia, you can control the house as well.
No.
Yes, I just want to pay attention in the meeting.
It is
Well,
now
somebody
in
help me
hands.
to check. Well, somebody help me to check that.
Click on more.
We have someone.
Go to the bottom. Everybody can please mute their microphone so that we can have this conversation between Tim and I, please.
Okay.
Please mute your.
Cynthia, can you give me the host right? Or Timothy, give me the host right. Let me mute all of
Tim,
those
I have already
backgrounds.
given you host rights. That's how you were able to set the. If you hover the bottom of your screen, there's an option for more. And you should be able to mute, and you should be able to mute all.
Okay, option for all, huh?
Yeah, mute all.
Okay.
Yeah, mute
I'm
all,
checking
please.
now.
Yeah, thanks.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, Cynthia. I can't find any mute all under my. If you can do that, please, you help me to do that so that I can pay attention to this meeting.
No. Timothy, you have the host right.
I am unable to do it because I do not have host rights anymore. But would you like me? Let me see if I can take host rights back.
I see.
Cynthia, you have the host right. Yeah, good. Now, Timothy, you have the host right.
Yes.
Timothy,
no,
you
I
have
just
the
gave
host
it
now.
Okay, I've muted him. I've muted him. It's okay. That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
No. You still have Ojo. You still have Ojo. You still have Ojo.
Mute. Okay.
Good.
Can you hear
Okay.
me, Tim?
Yes, I can hear you,
Yeah, I can
Cynthia.
hear you.
Once you mute everybody, then you'll have to make sure that you unmute when you want someone to speak. So
Right.
Yes,
the best
the
way
person needs,
to have for people to
please,
raise their
I
hand
want,
or
if you
clap.
want to speak, I want you to go to the sidebar of your screen where you see messages and you drop your messages, because we need to take all the panelists for us to hear from them first. I don't want people interfering into the conversation, please. Let's allow the conversation to flow. Thank you. Lisa Williams, back to you.
I'm sorry, but you'll have to repeat your question.
Oh, I see. Now, Lisa,
Sam, you have to mute.
can you hear me now, Lisa?
Yes.
Okay, I said that I guess that when you were growing up, you don't intend to be a sign language interpreter.
Not at all.
Yes, and I just want to understand what inspires you into this profession. Probably there are things that interpreters that are doing right that you wanted to also be in the profession, or there's something that really motivates you to come into the profession. So what's your motivating factor to come into interpreting profession, please?
Well, I worked for a brokerage firm, a finance company, and they hired a deaf man to come into the unit and do filing for us.
Okay.
And the other hearing people in the unit used to tease him and make jokes, and he was unaware. So I thought that if I learned sign language, I could tell on them and tell this young man when they were teasing him, and then he could beat them up. So I asked him to teach me sign language. And I forgot all about everybody else. I was so fascinated with the sign language. We would sit down every day on our lunch hour. I had a book. We went through the book. And after about a year of that, I had a huge vocabulary, but I didn't know the language and I still didn't quite understand what he was saying. So I went to school. And in my course of sign language education, I was exposed to career opportunities, and there were only 3 back then. There was job coach, where you would accompany somebody to their job when they were learning how to do it, and then sign through their training, and then that was it. There was rehab counselor, which required more education, and at that time I wasn't interested in furthering my education. Thank God that changed. And then there was sign language interpreter. And I had experienced a multitude of career paths up until that time, and I really didn't fit in the corporate world, and I didn't fit in the business world. And so I thought I might fit in the interpreter world because it was full of misfits. And so I took the training. I was encouraged to take the training. I auditioned for the training, took the training, passed the course, and and then I dropped my entire life, and the day I graduated, started to be a freelance interpreter. And what motivated me to get further and further involved was, one, the absence of Black interpreters, or I perceived an absence of Black interpreters, and an absence of Black deaf people, because I was trained in a world that was predominantly white. And so I was alone in my sign language classes. I was alone in my interpreter training, but I knew that I couldn't be the only one that pursued this path. So finally I met Kathleen Taylor from New York, and she is a Black interpreter, and she steered me to Black deaf advocates. And she steered me to a precursor of NAOBI, which was called Minority Interpreters for the Deaf. And actually, she also introduced me to RID. And so my passions grew as I started to understand what the community stood for, what their values were, and what they needed to have a voice and be heard. This was before the passing of the American Disabilities Act here in America. This was right after the Education Act that Wanda mentioned, the public laws that Wanda mentioned that govern education and then employment and then inclusion. And there was no enforcement. So even though they had laws, a lot of times they weren't followed because our profession wasn't respected, because the deaf population and the persons with disabilities population weren't respected. So I knew that somewhere along the line, I had to be involved in and instrumental in lending voice. So I used my hands to make them heard. And also you have to understand the history here in America. The disability rights legislation and fight came right after civil rights for Black people here in America. So I'm part of a generation that experienced life before and after the civil rights. And I saw the transition of our societies throughout that process. So I understood intrinsically what the goal was and what the outcomes could be. And so I had to be involved in that. And we are taught to pay forward. We are taught that we are giving gifts only to give them away. We are taught that we are charged with great responsibilities only to take on responsibilities. So that motivated me too.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Jack, are you there? Jack, I noticed that in Africa we don't have Lisa and Deborah Russell and Wanda made mention of some kind of collaboration. It shows that they are not all alone when they started the struggle. There are people they struggle together with when they started the struggle. Jack, I wonder if you have other people that struggle along with you. And looking at the African context, we don't have books, we don't have resources, we don't have anything that we are doing. At the moment, we don't have a symbolic of African Association of Sign Language Interpreters, a symbolic of it in the deaf community. We don't have it at the moment. We have the African Union of the Deaf, but I don't think that really takes care of the interest of the deaf people at the moment. So we are having that challenge because I see a lot of partnership happening with Wanda, with Lisa, with Deborah Russell, with the deaf community alone. What is your own experience in the African context? How have you been in this profession? How did you go through all this to this very particular point? Can you please share with us?
Thank you, Tim. What I can say is that we are actually right at the 40-year mark that Deborah and Wanda were talking about. We are still trying to develop our profession, and mostly in our African context, there is no recognition of first sign languages, and then secondly, the interpreting profession. So we are at that moment where we are looking at Europe, we are looking at America and saying they're already gone ahead of us. Just looking at our journey here in Kenya, 20 years ago when we started the association for the interpreters, there was nowhere to learn about ethics. Some of it was mainly deaf people saying, for example, when you interpret, they say, I prefer that interpreter because they don't talk about the assignment. Or I don't like that one because the assigning is not understood very well. So those are the formative times when we started thinking about the ethics and reading about other interpreters in other parts of the world made it a little bit easier for us to shape our code of ethics, and as Deborah said, ours is also a nine sentence code of ethics, and it talks about just the bare basic minimums of being an interpreter, that you show up on time, you dress well for the occasion, you choose the assignment that fits your skill, and also confidentiality and things like that. So our journey as Kenya Sign Language Interpreters Association started with the deaf, a few of the deaf leaders from the National Association coming together with the interpreters to form those 9 or 8 sentences and saying that we can begin there. And just looking broadly at the continent, we lack training programs. Therefore, there is no foundation for the ethics. When you don't have a training program, you can't enforce ethics, because first you have to be trained and know the tenets of the ethics so that you can adhere to them. And then secondly, we lack legislation that recognizes the profession and also for sign languages. So it becomes very difficult to behave professionally when there's no reference. And then we don't have a certification process that tells an interpreter that this is what you are signing up for and these are the rules of the game. If you look at other professions like teaching or lawyers, they do have this ethics and it's part of their training. And that's what we are missing. And the other thing I can mention is, even as we are in the late entrant into the profession, there are opportunities for us to collaborate. As we have formed the AFSLI platform for all of Africa, we're able to share these tenets and behaviors and belief systems so that we are able to be part and parcel of the profession as a continent. And we're hoping that in the next few years, in the next decade or so, there will be springing up of training programs within Africa, and also the regions coming together to talk about ethics. And just to let everybody know, within the AFSLI platform, where we meet on WhatsApp and talk about the profession, there are occasions where people ask, is this an ethical issue? How do I go about it? And they do get answers. And I think that's a way for us to grow, even as we talk to each other within the regions, in Africa, we're able to talk about the issues that we face. And one of my best times is when people are talking about quality, they're talking about, is it right to do this? Is it right to wear this kind of clothing to an assignment? It brings us to the point that we are consciously thinking about ethics, and we are thinking about how do I behave in this situation? And that's where I think our greatest strength will be as Africa, that we can come together despite the distances, despite the language barriers, that we are able to talk about these issues and agree amongst ourselves that before we go for that assignment, am I prepared? Am I able to provide the quality service that's needed? And then lastly, I will want to mention that one of the things that is lacking within the training realm is the assessment for the disposition of the interpreter. Once we know our temperaments, once we know what we are good at, it's very easy for us to develop that worldview that provides us the necessary skills to be a good interpreter. And we hope that we can someday in the future do a disposition survey for our interpreters in Africa, so that we are able to know the temperaments, the fit for the job, the matching for the job, and also how we behave in different situations. And I think that's what I can share for now.
Thank you so much, Jack. It's really wonderful hearing you speak. And myself, I have learned a lot from you, and I just want to pose a little question to you, Jack. This your experience, have you ever shared this your experience? Have you documented? Please, yes or no. Have you documented this your experience? Do you have any book that you've written to share this experience that you just told us about now?
Not really a book. I hope to write a book someday about my journey. But then one of the things that we do here is that we document all our training programs. We do little reports that we post online.
Mm-hmm.
And also one of the things that I have developed is that we were working on a curriculum for the interpreters, a diploma for interpreter training. And one of the modules that we have is the Code of Ethics. And one of the things that we are doing right now is to make it into a small article that will help the trainers and also help the interpreters. Just from the 8 lines, there are so many things that we can do with it. There's a lot of explanations, examples, and practicals that interpreters can do while they're training. And also it's helpful for practicing interpreters to read through and also look at the dilemmas that we present.
Thank you so much.
One of the things that I can share later is the write-up of so that we can share that with the platform for the African interpreters.
Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you so much. I just wanted to put this challenge across to you that we need to hear from you. We need you to document your story so that we, the younger interpreters, should read from what you're doing, and we should be able to at least move on from that, just like what Cynthia is doing with Norman's documents. So thank you so much, Jack. I am going to Cynthia now. Cynthia, I understand that more specific to the Code of Ethics, sign language interpreters in Nigeria, most especially, and in Africa, we know that dressing or the clothes you wear also is part of this ethical conduct. Before the advent of the regulations, what is it all about dressing codes? Did the regulations took care of it when the regulation came into place, or that happened even at that time? Because if you're saying it's all about being fair, it's all about being just, it's all about being confidential, it's all about this, then how did we come about the dressing code? Because I see sign language interpreters in Africa, some of us still wear our black clothes and go to interpret. Can you expatiate a little bit about that? Thank you.
Being transparent, I have been an interpreter for 35 years. My experience, I was pretty distant from RID. RID was in existence, dress codes were in existence. I lived very remotely in the country, predominantly white community from the time I was in 5th grade till I was graduated. And so for me, RID was this place in Washington, D.C., and they had rules, and I followed them because I was in the interpreting field and there was discussion of them, but I wasn't really deeply involved with RID. So my education came from deaf families that taught me sign language and took me under their wing. I can't hear out of my left ear. If I'm with them, I have to call myself half deaf because they're like, you can't hear off that whole side of your head, and this is the only side you hear out of, so you're half deaf. And my training and my education for Code of Ethics, loosely termed, was from the deaf community telling me this is what we like, this is what we don't like, this is what interpreters do, this is what interpreters shouldn't do, this is what you can't do, this is what you should do, oh, do that, oh, don't do that, we're gonna teach you how to do this. So as I'm transitioning into a professional space, my core, the thing in me says, gravitate towards doing what deaf people need. So it could be said I have deaf hearts. They'll call it deaf hearts. you love deaf community, you're there for them. At the same time, you have to balance that with placing value on access. So when it comes to clothing and how we dress, I really don't think that I'm qualified to speak to the standards and how they've come in and gone. I can tell you how it's impacted me. In a space where white interpreters dominate, the requirement is black on black on black on black. You wear black shirts, black suits, black, everything up top is black. You might even wear black pants. And so you have a closet full of black clothes. And whatever space you go into, you wear black clothes. Like if you show up as an interpreter outside of black clothes, people look at you and they're like, oh, so where are you from? Like, what kind of interpreter are you? You're not wearing the code of ethic clothes. But that rule of thumb doesn't apply to all of us. When I moved and transitioned to other spaces, it was more, for example, video relay service. Video relay service is where you have a deaf person with a device at their home that connects to their internet service so that they can make phone calls. And those phone calls get processed through a call center where interpreters are ready to take calls and interpret calls. You're only seen visibly from your waist up, like we are here. So what you wear for pants, do you, but everything up top was black. And then you started to see transition into other colors. But for me personally, if I showed up to my job in a different color shirt other than black, the criticism was higher for me as a black interpreter. I saw other white interpreters and other interpreters of color, different races, wearing different colors, and it seemed fine. But when I showed up in anything other than a black shirt, it was like, oh, you can't wear that. Don't you know we have a rule? You got to wear black, and it has to contrast. But what contrasts white skin, there's a different contrast for brown skin. So in some of the that I worked in, for example, the video relay service space, when I became a director, what was called an advisory committee, where it was several of us who were black directors, and we navigated the needs and concerns of other black interpreters working in the industry. For that particular company, there was about 5,000 to 6,000 interpreters, and only 200 were black. So you can imagine that there was some oppression that was happening even within that group, because you have so little of us representing. And one of the things that they did when they conducted what they called summits, where they got a certain number of chosen black interpreters to come together and really talk about their experiences as interpreters, their experience in the VRS setting. What were some things that they were feeling negatively impact them? What were some things they needed? One of the discussions brought forth that as black interpreters, the dress code cannot be standard with what is the predominant, which is white. So that ushered in a little bit of a recognition that black can't be the color all the way around. There are interpreters who show up to assignments and they're told, I'm sorry, you're not wearing black. This doesn't work. And then there are black interpreters who show up in black who are told, I'm sorry, the whole black on black, your skin is black, your clothes are black, it doesn't work, go home. We're always at the liberty of being sent home. And at the same time, there's much to be learned. As a video relay service interpreter, I became very used to, I could wear all kinds of colors and bright and vibrant patterns on my pants, as long as everything up top was solid and black and a little bit of other colors, but mostly black. Until I moved to the East Coast, now I'm interpreting in different spaces, more federal spaces, and I actually had a peer tell me, look, you keep dressing like you're a VRS interpreter. You need to be dressing professional in case you show up and the president comes in, which could happen in the DC area. You always need to be ready for that. So I realized that I can't wear the VRS standard of dress when I'm interpreting outside of VRS. And so code of ethics, what are we talking about? How does that apply? There's code of ethics is very layered. How do we exercise that code of ethics with what the deaf consumer wants, with what the hearing consumer wants? What does the agency want? the spaces that we're working in. Are we VRI? Are we VRS? Are we medical? Are we legal? Are we federal? Are we technical? Are we in an environment where it's a sports setting? Are we outside in the mud, as was mentioned earlier? If we don't see it as layered and we see it as only one way, which is typically going to go the direction of the majority, which is white interpreters, then we don't have accommodation for the interpreters. So the very person providing access doesn't have access to being able to blend in with the community. So for me, when it comes to dress, I'm now of the space that is just me. I can't look at other people. I wear suits. I try to make sure that my suits don't echo too much. I wear very little jewelry, so there's not a lot of noise on my hands. My nails used to be longer, they're shorter. There's so many layers to your dress. It's not just your dress, then it's your hair. Some interpreters struggle because they wear head wraps. Some struggle because they wear locks, and people consider that not professional. I wear straight hair, I'm seen as professional. But what happens on the days when I come and my hair is curly and puffed out? How do you see me then? So our dress is everything. It's not just the clothes we put on, it's the jewelry that we wear. I wear glasses. Sometimes I'm really conscious of the fact that there's glare on my glasses. So I take my glasses off to interpret so it doesn't interfere. So how does that all work with code of ethics? Does it do harm? Does it not do harm? Are we taking into consideration our consumer? Are we taking into consideration hearing and deaf consumers? There's so many layers to it. And if we can, for me, if we can see it as layers and then look at each of the layers, it helps so much better to understand what the end result and goal is.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for taking your time for you to be able to make this explanation. And I know that Deborah Russell and Wanda and Lisa would like. Lisa's hand has been up since, and I think Lisa, I would like you to make a comment on. Maybe you want to say something. Let me just hear what you want to say briefly, just in few seconds. Can you talk?
Okay, I first wanted to speak to what Jack was saying. And I think that the assumption of interpreters in America is that all things are equal, and they are not. White interpreters have a marked advantage over Black interpreters in terms of education, training, practice, and everything. So back in when we were starting and we were forming and we were emerging as a profession collectively, there still weren't resources that were available for Black interpreters. So we turned to our deaf organizations for that training. So we got trained in church and we got trained in the deaf organizations because that's where we could practice. That's where we could make mistakes. Those were our safe places. When we left those arenas, it became competitive. So we depended a lot. We forged relationships with these organizations so we can be trained and they had access to information. So that's how the collaboration started in the community that we talk about, that we had no other choice. In terms of ethics, there's an overarching tenet that says do no harm. And that is the first platform that you launch your ethical reasoning from. And there's tenets and there's models and there's all of this stuff. But the bottom line is you have to do no harm. So an ethical decision is always everybody wins. You know, everybody walks away with not being harmed. And that's the platform from which you launch your ethics. And of course, there are cultural considerations what a lot of models don't consider, especially when they cross into cultures that are not of the mainstream. The mainstream tends to view themselves as cultureless And the rest of us are very cultural beings. So for instance, if somebody that is the same age as my grandmother walks in the room and I have to interpret for them, it's a different dynamic. My boundaries are different because I know that if I disrespect this woman, my mother's gonna slap me in the head, you know? And the mainstream might not have those kinds of cultural considerations to make. So it is the law, it is your own morality, it is the tenet, the overarching tenet of do no wrong, and then it's the relationships and what's expected of you in that relationship. And I'm not saying that we should be enablers, because we have to draw lines and stand, but we have to respect those cultural norms and those cultural relationships. And on your question about where the standards for dress come from, this is our platform. This is our background. And so we can have a lot of things going on in our background because somebody looking at this, plus our hands moving. There are studies that have revealed that that's painful for the eyes. It can deteriorate eyesight. It can be distorted. It can distort things. It can be distracting. So we tend to wear, it's strongly suggested, and it is the standard, that we wear a solid color on our back. That solid color.
Please mute your device.
That solid color should contrast our skin for visibility. And then all the extras, the jewelry, all that stuff, it's distracting. And then certain communities are going to be sensitive to that, like in mental health. Jiggling bracelets could be a trigger for an episode. And so we have to consider those things when we dress and be as plain as possible and as non-distracting as possible, and as invisible as we can be, because we are not, it's in our code of ethics, and it is a standard in our community that we're not the main attraction in any encounter. All we want to do is facilitate communication and step back far enough to kind of be unseen. And if we walk into the room and we're all lights and colors and bright and stuff, that detracts from the communication dynamic. So that's where all of that stuff was born, in being neutral, in an attempt to be neutral and an attempt to be invisible.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I would like to go to Deborah Russell. Deborah, I just want to, I'm seeing all this, and I think it's a lot of mental processing for sign language interpreters to make a lot of decisions in the place of doing their different assignments. And you will agree with me with the COVID-19, the coronavirus that is now in the world and has come to stay with us. There are a lot of issues that has to do with mental processing. I can as well tell you that even in the African context, our situation deals with a lot of mental processing as well. Because first of all, you know, you're going to a program that the setting is not well structured to the benefit of your clients. You can enter into a room and you discover that the room has several pillars, that the deaf clients might be sitting across the pillar or behind the pillar. And it's difficult for you to be able to. So when you come into, instead of paying attention to the interpreting, you have to start discussing with the organizers together with the deaf person on how the seating arrangement, and this goes with a lot of mental processing. The same thing also when it comes to rewarding system. You go to do some certain jobs and you know that you're not paid at the end of the job. And the organizers are bent in frustrating you by making the environment not conducive for you to even do the job in the first place. So there are a lot of issues of mental health in this kind of situation. So as you discuss about the issue of the dress code, which I know that you might like to say a word about it, what do you think about sign language interpreters decision-making process, and also the issue of mental health. What's your advice? Deb, I'm waiting for you, Deborah. Can you hear me?
Hi, does that work? People
Yeah,
can hear
good,
me?
good, good.
Okay, thank you so much for the, yes, can you hear me?